So interesting in Middlemarch how prominent clothing is, fashion. Eliot puts such emphasis on the physical appearance of her characters. Dorothea's plain or methodistical dress with her corona bonnet, and then her mourning dress is such a big part of her character, which is really true of all Eliot's characters. And she gives them such a vivid physical aspect. That's why I think it really helps to see film or TV representations. This is, I think, a part of, Eliot's general view of power of social interaction and the web, contextual factors. So much of who we are is determined by how we show each other who we are, how we communicate each other. First and foremost, physically, in our physical appearance. This, in other words, is the performative theory of identity. You are something that you perform. And that relates very interestingly, I think, to historicism in Middlemarch. Historicism, likewise, is the idea that, reality is something that happens in time. We are so prone to this kind of Platonic thinking where we abstract and analyze what's real in terms of timeless concepts. But Middlemarch is really so much about how reality is what happens while you're making other plans. I think an important point to make about Ladislaw's character, who combines both, perhaps the most performative, besides maybe Rosie, that's what they kind of have in common, is their performativity, singing together, and elaborate dress. But whereas Rosie's idea of herself is nothing but the performance of conformity, cut-out model of perfect woman, Ladislaw is self-consciously stylized, a dandy. And one of the key statements of the novel, I think, Lydgate characterizes Ladislaw walking around with Miss Noble as a couple dropped out of a romantic comedy. You know his look, he says to Dorothea, you know how Will looks. He projects an identity. It's like the shaping activity of Rosie's eyes, but Will is a gypsy and a self-stylized one. He represents kind of modern bohemian self-inventing, and his dress is just as much a part of that as anything. His dress, his language. The point is this is a individual who's making do, like going back to what I was saying about workers, the peasants' perspective and their reliance on the weather, on context, the, minimal resources they have to make do in a social system that marginalizes them so thoroughly. Will, likewise, is on the margins. He's struggling as an outsider. He's struggling against prejudice, class prejudice, nationalist prejudice, and this moralistic prejudice, all these things. We're getting a picture of freedom as self-invention, performative self-invention, that has a pastiche aspect to it. Just take what you can use. It's like street fashion. It's grassroots to a certain degree. Language the same way. It's deriving value from a resource that is available free to everyone. Friedrich Nietzsche's famous prayer saying, one thing is needful to give style to one's character. That's how we distinguish ourselves. That's how we find individual identity and purpose. If you think of yourself historically and materialistically, then self-creation, self-invention is like a dance, a performance art. Not to over-dramatize it, but that's what literature is for. Fashion is a kind of self-expression, just like writing is a kind of self-expression. It strikes me here when we were talking last time about Miss Cadwallader's warning to Dorothea not to isolate herself at Lowick and play tragedy queen and take things sublimely. Instead, she's supposed to get herself back out on the marriage market. That's what Cadwallader means effectively when she says, you'll Stop calling things by the same name as other people call them by. And Dorothy, of course, replies, well, sorry, I never called things by the same name other people do. This recalls a funny line from first few pages of she says, women were supposed to have weak opinions. The great safeguard of society and domestic life was that opinions were not acted upon. In a way, women's weak-mindedness serves as a kind of emblem justifying the hypocrisy of marriage in general or society in general. Opinions in general are not supposed to be acted upon. Sane people did what their neighbors did so that if any lunatics were at large, one might know and avoid them. So in this context, Dorothy is like, hell yes, I'm a lunatic. Dorothea's adamant defense of her own lunacy or, nonconformity is adamant because it's connected to her concern for people who Miss Cadwallader, for instance, dismisses as animals and monsters, non-people. So there are two things at stake in this question of calling things by the same name as other people. It's what you call, what you name, in particular what gets named as a person, what is noticed as human or mattering, counting in the democratic conversation. But secondly, another way of putting the same question is how your speaking itself, your calling, how you call things embodies personhood, represents, performs personhood in a particular way. As embodies a certain kind of voice, in other words. So calling things by other names is to give different names to things, name things that otherwise went unnamed, but that is also a new kind of speaking. It's about putting a new thing in the world, which is a new voice, embodying personhood in new kinds of speaking. Voice is an instrument not of reason, knowledge, sanity, objectivity, logic, but music. A very key metaphor for Eliot's realism, remember, is music. Music cannot be rationalized the way language can be. Everybody has a unique voice, it's idiosyncratic. The way in which we oddly differentiate from each other contributes rather than detracts from what we enjoy as music. Remember, that's how Eliot describes realism in the essay on Ruskin. It's really a basic thing what poetry is about. What are the limits of communication? We're taking language, propositional language that has strict rules for proper communication, for how to build a signal and distinguish it from noise. And poetry is just about messing with that and inventing new kinds of signal, new kinds of meaning, and new ways of meaning. So much of experience does not fit into that, clear category, clear binary of correct or incorrect. Eliot is very sensitive to that. That's really what the web is all about, is how everything's kind of mixed up with everything else and trying to, these stark, rigid distinctions really are hard to sustain. Bulstrode shrank from a direct lie with an intensity disproportionate to the number of his more indirect misdeeds. So that's to say, he's avoiding direct lies, yet implicitly engaging in a disproportionate number of indirect lies. And I think that's not just about Bulstrode, that's about the human condition and how so much of it is unconscious. What a small part of our experience is our conscious intended meanings. These misdeeds were like the subtle muscular movements which are not taken account of in the consciousness, though they bring about the end that we fix our mind on and desire. Often we tell ourselves we're doing one thing, but we're actually doing something else. This is a great example of that in this chapter. Both Fred and Lydgate are kind of lying to themselves, which about not wanting to gamble, which is exactly what allows them to gamble. That other example, telling himself he's not her captive, he became her captive. The ability of music, and by extension poetry, to communicate what we are not conscious of, to communicate emotions so effectively, is that we communicate musically before we communicate through language. Parents communicate musically with newborns, and even in utero, emotions then originate and are initially cultivated through this basically musical communication. Humans are unique for imagining this idea of absolute truth, divorced from any communicative group. We're kind of confused by how, musical communication could even work, even though it's the most basic to who we are, the most intuitive and emotionally rich, speaks most richly to our actual experience in the world. After all, objective truth is a view from nowhere. It's what we can never actually experience. This great drawing here, view from the left eye, is really cool, because it gets at what Eliot is describing here as the unconscious, subtle, muscular movements underlying our conscious experience. We usually take what we see as, objective, the view from nowhere. We think we see objective reality, but it's only by erasing, canceling out the actual body that frames our vision. So this drawing is so cool, how it tries to approximate, no, this is what you actually see. And we forget that, because we idealize what we see as, again, as if it were just objective sight from nowhere, from a disembodied perspective. And I think that's what, the miniature does for Dorothea's, very explicitly described as vividly, physically coming to life as Dorothea projects emotional realities into that miniature. So listen to how Eliot narrates Bulstrode's equivocation when he's deliberating how to treat Raffles. It's sort of an attempt to do the minimally justifiable thing. A man vows, and yet will not cast away the means of breaking his vow. Is it that he distinctly means to break it? Not at all. But the desires which tend to break it are at work in him dimly, and make their way into his imagination and relax his muscles in the very moments when he's telling himself over again the reason for his vow. It's so interesting how that's narrated. I mean, she's talking about a man, a generic man, so it's not necessarily Bulstrode, but it's as if it could also be Bulstrode's internal reflections on an impersonal situation analogous to his own. It's him thinking through the scenario of a man, in his situation. But it's this lack of guilty intent which allows the desires which tend to break it to keep at work dimly. See what I mean? What's interesting about this text, I think, is that Eliot really isn't deciding for us whether he's guilty or not. He's just laying out a very complex situation, very blurry, I think, to show how a kind of guilt of omission, right? Rather than guilt of commission. and how the moral question isn't addressed by the, intentional culpability. Again, that the lack of intent can precisely enable tendencies she describes here that relax his muscles in the very moments when he's telling himself why he can't do wrong. It's also interesting how Lydgate's dalliance with gambling and opium is narrated. Rather than a positive desire, it's sort of like a gravitational force lures Lydgate to gambling. It's a force of circumstance. It's interesting how much this resonates with our own time, right? Circumstantial factors like opium, gambling, or risks that are objective in the atmosphere, in the environment, that people do fall prey to at a certain rate, not because they positively choose it, but just because they're vulnerable to it in a way they otherwise might never know. So the narrator writes, so just as he tried opium, so he thought now to begin to turn upon gambling, not with any appetite for its excitement, but with a sort of wistful inward gaze after that easy way of getting money, which implied no asking and brought no responsibility. An opportunity to dream that's available in the environment, and that is a fantasy in particular of escape from money worries. That's just like easy credit, money stores. It's just something you can fall into inadvertently. So what's interesting about how this is narrated, she says pretty clearly here that like gambling, this could have been his fate. If he were in Paris or London, that would have been over. He just would have gambled himself into ruin. Or he gets exposed to a possible fate for himself, hypothetical fate, and gets pulled back at the last second. And at the same time, Fred sees a mirror of his own fate in Lydgate's compulsive gambling, and that kind of scares him straight. By the same token, Fred kind of plays fair brother for Lydgate and rescues him from worse losses. There's an interesting kind of series of doppelgangers that get set up here, almost as if these characters were surrogate readers, like they were reading about themselves in the real world. So Eliot's kind of suggesting how life is like a novel, or novels teach us about life by running through hypothetical scenarios so we don't actually have to live them through without having to suffer the consequences in reality. And incidents which happened not very long after that airy notion of getting aid from his uncle had been excluded was a strong sign of the effect that might have followed any extant opportunity of gambling. So it's interesting. She's really, I think, commenting on gambling addiction. She says explicitly he's not that interested in gambling. He watched gamblers with pity in Paris before. So she's really saying it's a objective risk in the environment. This fate that people get sucked into this fate, just like drug addiction. That's really interesting. This is kind of modern, kind of social science or public health perspective that Eliot's presenting here. This damage is just objective in the environment. Doesn't necessarily require a moral failing on the part of the people that suffer it. The way Fred's temptation by gambling is narrated is really a wonderful example of the way in which our mind, if we want to do something, but we don't want to admit it to ourselves, our minds are so good at coming up with alibis, rationalizations. We're so gullible. There should be no reason why I should not play at billiards, but he was determined not to bet. And then he goes on to, he actually probably should, if there were a good chance of a bet. Why? Sovereigns were flying about. Why shouldn't he catch a few? A man likes to assure himself what he could do in a way of mischief if he chose. It's like, I should see like what it's like to do something wrong. I really should. That would be the right thing to do. I love how she's able to just kind of give the sheen, the vague appearance, plausible argument or reasoning. I love the kind of absurdity. Like, man likes to assure himself what he could do in the way of mischief if he chose. Like, it's not like I'm actually doing it. I'm just doing it as a test. It's such a, I think, interesting psychological insight. Both our gullibility, our susceptibility to this kind of rationalization, but also on the other hand, like the fact that we need to go through this rigmarole, this charade. The fact that we need these rationalizations, that we bother to go through all this kind of false justification in our heads. This is really kind of a stream of consciousness paragraph. So by the end, he gives up reasoning altogether. He does not enter into formal reason, which is a very artificial, inexact way of representing the tingling returns of old habit. So it's become a kind of physical compulsion, the caprices of young blood. But there was lurking in him a prophetic sense that evening that when he began to play, he should also begin to bet. It's like, again, it's in the atmosphere. It's a mood that is determining his behavior more than it's a deliberate choice, right? That he should enjoy some punch drinking and in general prepare himself for feeling rather seedy in the morning. It is in such indefinable movements that action often begins. That's so interesting. At the beginning of the evening, his destiny the next morning is already sealed. That's such a great description of kind of addictive behavior, and it strikes me as it's so modern. It's really wild to be reading in Victorian context. So we've talked a lot about Feuerbach's idea that one finds one's moral conscience in other people. Because we can play such games with ourselves, we rely on other people to keep us honest. And this is such a great example of that. It's as if Fairbrother Fred and Lydgate are all kind of versions of each other, and they're relying on a kind of combined awareness to keep each other in line. It's what she calls it, a sort of regenerating shudder through the frame. It's what Fairbrother gives Fred. It sort of inadvertently gives Lydgate. And Lydgate gives Fred as well. Fred sees sort of a bad echo of himself. And I mean, once again, it's Fairbrother that's being the most selfless and heroic. Though you can tell that he, I think, comes out feeling like a winner too. He feels like having the opportunity to save Fred was a chance for him to save himself from being selfish. But what I want to emphasize is how it's kind of like reading a novel, like staging. We get to stage a scenario and see its implications. Consider how it would look in other people's eyes. Losing yourself to compulsive behavior, circumstances kind of that take over your own will. Being able to read novels and notice these situations, see things through other people's points of view, the way novels teach us how to do. That's how we counteract these systemic risks in the modern environment of the modern world. This, just really notice how the Fairbrother here, it's as if he writes a little story for Fred and plays it out. He says, I'm going to have to confess to you, Fred, when somebody told me that Vincey's been at the billiard table every night again, he won't bear the curb long. I was tempted to do the opposite of what I'm doing now. So he teaches Fred by telling him what he is not doing, what he was tempted to do, but is refraining to do, precisely by telling him about it instead of actually doing it. Isn't that interesting? He's turning his temptation into a story, and thereby saving himself and Fred alike. So I think this is a great example of how Eliot sees literature as, means of salvation, means of cultivating that moral conscience by teaching us to look at things through different perspectives. It's a great detail, too, here that after Fairbrother says this, first thing Fred says is, I haven't made any bets, even though we just went through. He's already anticipating feeling seedy the next morning. So Fairbrother says finally, I could hardly secure myself better than by telling you just what had gone on in me, what I was tempted to do. And now, do you understand me? I want you to make the happiness of her life in your own. If there's any chance that a word of warning from me may turn aside any risk to the contrary, well, I have uttered it. And I just think that's really fascinating, that he's turned this temptation into salvation by making it a story that he tells Fred about what he was tempted to do but isn't doing. And it's really interesting. And I think, again, really revealing about how Eliot conceives the moral potential of literature, the moral power, the power of literature for moral instruction. The fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin comes up in an interesting way, I think. It's a story that Mary Garth knows by heart and is entertaining the little daughters of Mrs. Vincey. So just on the surface, it's interesting how Mary's storytelling abilities endear her maybe to Mrs. Vincey despite herself. She's so snooty at first about the Garths' social rank and Mary's plainness. But when she sees how much the children are enjoying hearing Rumpelstiltskin, that warms her to her. And she explicitly is described as attractive. So that's another, I think, maybe signal about the value of literature. It introduces a kind of attractiveness, a kind of pleasure that overcomes social prejudices. And Rumpelstiltskin itself, I think, is really fascinating. It's a unique fairy tale in that it's about the magic power of words, and I think that's part of the special pleasure of reading it out loud for kids, is that they get to that magic power is something that happens in the reading. That Rumpelstiltskin saying the word is a sensational event that kids get to experience directly. And the image of the imp stamping his foot and going into the ground is amazing. That's uncanny and haunting. I mean, the theme of the fairy tale is commodification, right? Spinning gold out of out of straw, but it's like this ability to spin gold, create money. Specifically modern conception of value is money value. Everything can be translated into money. Contrasted with that is this uncanny power of the word Rumpelstiltskin, the image of the imp plunging himself down into the earth, these are what seduce the children, you know, that it's like, whoa. I think this again tells us something about how Eliot conceives the power of literature. That, you know, just what makes me think of the word that Fairbrother utters. If there's a word, if there's any chance that a word of warning from me may turn aside any risk to the contrary, well, I've uttered it. The power of the word, that's sort of it sends a shudder, a regenerative shudder through Fred. That regenerative power of the word. So how does that relate to the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin? Well, Rumpelstiltskin is about reproduction. The Rumpelstiltskin wants her baby, wants the miller's daughter's baby. He ultimately gets deprived of the power of reproduction, participating in human reproduction. In the story, commodification wins out. The woman is commodified. It's basically a patriarchal economy. The miller sells his daughter to the king, and so it's not like a particularly happy ending in that respect. But there's a regenerative power in the word Rumpelstiltskin itself. I think, you know, that is what gets acted out when we see how excited the girls are by the story. That's what people remember from the story. That's what's getting regenerated. A different kind of body is getting reproduced through the utterance of the word, like through the telling of the story. This uncanny body that impales the earth, the power of a name that's, you know, can cause that effect. A new kind of enchanted sense of the word, the body, the earth, may be left with the reader. It seems to be left with the Vincy girls. And it seems to me akin to the word Fairbrother speaks to Fred. That word is regenerative in a similar way, gives Fred back his body, you know. Lydgate refers to the gamblers as diseased. He feels pity for them when he watches them in Paris. Fairbrother's word here restores Fred's body, a kind of bodily integrity to him. I think that's